Aircraft carriers going north for one of the biggest fleet air arm jobs of the war. Attack on the German battleship Tirpitz in Fjord, Norway. The planes detailed for the assault were the new Barracudas, with an escort of Seafire, Corsair, Hellcat and Wildcat fighters. The pilots are getting ready for the great sortie.
Well, the German battleship Tirpitz was a sister ship to the Bismarck. She was probably the most powerful battleship in the European theatre of war anyway, and was a menace because at this time we were doing the Russian convoys. It was a real thorn in Churchill's side. He kept at the Admiralty, can't you do something about this ship? She only got out once and then she didn't really. It didn't do a lot of damage, but she was a threat because if she had got out with her enormous guns, she could have sunk a whole convoy from a distance and nobody could have done anything about her. I mean, the typical example of the fear of Tirpitz was that terrible PQ-17 convoy, which was told to disperse. Anyway, so there was a lot of pressure on the Navy to do something about Tirpitz, and they tried everything, including the X-class mini-submarines, which did do some damage, and we kept trying with the fleet air arm.
The Tirpitz had been a problem for the Navy for a long time by merely existing, because there were great fears that it would do another Bismarck, and she had to be kept firmly at anchor if possible, or on the bottom was even more preferable. So it was a question of knowing where she was, and wherever she was, then being harassed and kept out of the open ocean. And on this particular occasion she was up in a fjord, a smaller fjord called Fjord off Fjord, and that is near Hammerfest, right in the northern tip of Norway. And it was decided that the fleet would have another go, because there had been earlier strikes, at putting her out of action. Anyway, when we got back up to Scapa Flow, we still hadn't done any deck landings in a Hellcat, so we all had to go off and do that, which was aboard HMS Indefatigable, to which the squadron was posted for Operation Goodwood, which was the strikes against the Tirpitz. And so we did hurriedly about 4 or 5 deck landings each, and then we were described as fully operational. And as far as Operation Goodwood was concerned, the main fleet ships that were used for the purpose went up to Norway as part of a Russian convoy, really. It was more or less a strike force in disguise. But that was the object of the exercise, was to try and put Tirpitz out of commission.
Between about March and July, I think in '44, we were working up the Indefatigable. And then we set off on I think it was 2 separate missions to attack the Tirpitz, which was still a tremendous threat to the Russian convoys lying up in the northern fjords of Norway. She was attacked by barracudas, and it was always a hopeless business. Our aircraft were basically pretty slow. They had to approach up this very long fjord. We never achieved surprise. They were always ready, waiting for us. There was a tremendous amount of flak, both from the Tirpitz herself and from batteries all around her and in the hills above. We had barracudas. And if I recall rightly, it was the first Hellcat squadron, mainly Poles and New Zealanders, who were immensely brave in their attacks, and who, after the frustrations of the first 1 or 2 attacks, became so totally determined to get the target that they... one certainly dived his aircraft straight down the funnel of the Tirpitz. That's what he aimed at, and he hit someone near there. But even so, we never really did enough damage to the Tirpitz, and the Tirpitz continued to be a threat, and subsequently attacked by midget submarines. Basil Place got his VC, and ultimately destroyed by those special massive bombs the RAF produced, which sufficient of which went off alongside her one day to capsize her.
And off we set, and it was pretty rough sea. I can remember that as we set forth. It was quite a little task group put together to mount these attacks. I can't remember which ships they were now, but there was Formidable, Furious, the old Fury box as we used to call her. They're Implacable. We had an escort carrier up there as well. So it was a fairly big task group. We got a 3D scale model of Fjord, where she was moored, right up round the North Cape of Norway. So we used to study that, and we used to do some practice strikes on some lochs up in the north of Scotland, which is somewhat similar, because the field where she was moored had quite high mountains around it, and you had to have a sort of a traffic pattern. Otherwise, with the number of aircraft involved, all in these narrow fields, you could have had mid-air collisions quite easily. Eventually we got up there, and the first strike, we formed up, we had Barracudas aboard then, not Avengers. And I think the other carriers also had Barracudas as their dive bombers. And some of them had, don't know any others with Corsairs. Some of the other carriers had Hellcats. Anyway, first time we took off with quite a big striking force. So we formed up at low level to keep under the German radar. And there must have been, I don't know, probably about 40 Barracudas, some of our ship and some of the other ships, and fighter escorts ourselves in the Corsairs and the Hellcats.
There were 3 aircraft carriers up there, the Furious, the Indefatigable, and I'm not sure of the third one, but that would have represented over about 150 aircraft altogether, a mixed bag of fighters, fighter bombers and torpedo bombers. I think there were Barracudas, which were the principal torpedo bomber. There were Fireflies, which were to deal with the ground attack side of it. The Hellcats were supposed to play a dual role as fighter cover and also dive bombers. So we were all fitted with 500-pound bombs and long-range tanks, because it was quite a long way in off the coast. I suppose the flight inward from the ships to the target was something of the order of 3/4 of an hour. So that 3/4 of an hour had to be multiplied there and back, plus the time over target, so that the whole operational flight was something of the order of 3 hours. So additional tanks were required for this.
We formed up very, very low, about under 200 feet when we took off. And then we circled around. Each carrier formed up either ahead or astern, depending on where she was in the formation. And then the air group leader in the Barracuda circled the fleet, and we all joined up, all below 200 feet. And we remained like that until we actually saw the coast. Tirpitz was lying about 60 miles inland, so there was no way you could get in there undetected. And then, of course, the Barracudas had to gain height, and fully loaded, it took them some time to get up to 10,000 feet. And meanwhile, the fighters were sort of weaving around above and below and behind to protect them against any enemy air attack, which didn't materialize.
And our main job was to escort them in case of interception by German fighters. In fact, we had no air opposition, but having got to Fjord, our job was a bit suicidal when I think back on it, to strafe the attack positions to try and give protection for the poor old Barracudas to come in and dive bomb with their 1,600-pound armour-piercing bombs. But the big problem there was, although we stayed at sea level to hopefully be underneath the radar to the last minute, you had to climb up before you got to the coast because you've got to get over these mountains. And of course, climbing, you're not so fast, especially the old Barracudas. It gave the Germans time from when they first picked us up to start their smoke canisters, which were arranged all around Fjord. And the result was, when you actually got over the target, it looked like a bathtub full of cotton wool. Couldn't see the ship. Anyway, we did the best we could. They did get a few hits, I think.
Because being in the land of the midnight sun, more or less, we had to get up at 4 in the morning, I think it was, or 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the morning. And we had our breakfast, and we were airborne by about 5. And this in broad daylight, of course. And it took, I suppose, about 15 to 20 minutes to get all the aircraft off the decks of the three ships, and they formed up as a fairly large formation with the torpedo bombers below, and ourselves about 2,000 feet above them, I suppose. And then we flew over the coast. Once we'd crossed the coast, we climbed. We had to, of course, because it was a very mountainous area, and but we still wanted to get as much radar cover as possible. So we went in very low over the sea, but we climbed up rapidly after that. And there was snow on those beautiful mountains. It looked absolutely splendid. But I suppose when we got to the target area, things began to hot up a lot. There wasn't any aircraft opposition, at least not that I remember. But the anti-aircraft fire was extremely concentrated, as indeed it could be in a fjord, which is a bit like an amphitheatre, really. And, of course, the Germans had always used this business of smoke screens so that the target would be completely obliterated and you wouldn't be able to see it. And these screens were activated usually as soon as they had first radar information that aircraft were on their way, so that there was a lot of smoke in this fjord at the time we got there. And then it was just a question of our job was to dive bomb her, of course, and that is what we did. Very difficult to tell whether you were making strikes or not. You were usually reliant on other observers in other aircraft to tell what the result was. But then, having finished that, you were off dealing with any targets that you could find en route, and this was seaplanes, there were smaller ships, there were destroyers, there were radar stations.
I think in all there must have been between 100 and maybe 130 aircraft from the three carriers. So it was a fairly sizable strike. The field was covered in smoke, but the AA positions were on the hills all around. So you could see pretty well. And we also had very good aerial photographs, which had been taken by the RAF. So we knew pretty well where these were. But it meant sort of flying down the barrels of the guns, more or less, which wasn't very pleasant. And we had, I think, almost everybody was hit somewhere by small arms fire. The whole thing becomes rather confused. After you've done your first run at a target, then you had to pull up away in order to come down again, and you didn't quite know where you were after the first attack. So it was rather difficult to find the next target exactly. There were some destroyers out, about 3 destroyers outside the smoke. And so we had to go at those with .5s, really. 0.5 gun on a destroyer is not very effective, but we tried to strike the bridges and these ships. Then that went on for about 3 or 4 days. And I think after the first day, it was decided to send in the fireflies, which we didn't have on board our ship. I think they came from Fjord, perhaps. And they went in with 500-pound bombs, very low all the way in. So they literally flew up the fjord at absolutely nil, 100 feet or so. And as they approached the target, they went up like this. And so they got in there, not entirely undetected, but they actually saw the Tirpitz because the Germans hadn't got the smoke going in time. So they were the only people. I never saw a ship at all.
It was the next time, I think, the second strike. Somebody had a brainwave. Why don't we happen to have 4 Corsairs that have got bomb racks? The Corsair was slowly modified as the time went on, and we'd got only 4. And our boss, Judy Garland, suggested, and everyone thought it was a good idea, instead of being hampered by staying with the Barracudas, why don't we form up with just 4 Corsairs with bombs on, and we'll go in ahead of everybody else. Instead of everyone all form up, we'll take off and we'll go straight in. We might get there when we can still see the ship. And so I was his wingman in those days. I wasn't. Chris Cartledge, another one of my squadron mates who I still see, he was one of the other 4 on this thing. He says we were volunteers. I don't remember volunteering personally. Anyway, and they decided for some unknown reason that we would have one 1,000-pound bomb under one wing. And they didn't know quite how the Corsair would cope with this when it got over the bow. We had the whole strike force spotted at the aft end of the ship. We 4 were up in the bows near the forward lift. We all started up. You get this thing in the carrier, start engines, and you all warm up together, and then the ship turns into when you can take off. So we started with them. Then once the engines were warmed up, we switched off and they struck us down the forward lift. And all the aircraft were up on decks. The hangar was empty. Whistlers, as we call it, they whistled us back. The other guys were all taking off and then milling around, forming up. We came up the aft lift with warm engines, started up immediately and took off and had the whole length of the flight deck to get off. It was fine, because we got plenty of room. We were fine with this 1,000-pound bomb on the wing. We flew in then ahead of everybody else. We went up, I think it was Lang Fjord, a very long fjord, quite close to Fjord. And at the top end of it, the inner end, there were 2 or 3 cruisers, I think they were. And we were at about 10,000 feet. And I was looking down, they got no beautiful shapes, you know. And then I thought, because we look a bit like Stukers without. And they think we're Germans, they're signalling to us. You can see these lights flashing. And then these, they weren't lights, they were bloody gun flashes, I could see. Anyway, we actually, sadly enough, Judy had put us in the line of stone by then, ready to go into the dive. Number 4 had a direct hit. So he didn't come back. Anyway, Judy, me and Chris, Judy dropped out 1,000-pound bombs. I mean, they were general purpose bombs with the armour plating on for me on Tirpitz. I don't know what they thought they were going to do. The whole idea was thinking it might get the Germans to get their heads down a bit, give the Barracudas a bit better of a chance to come in. But we could just see the outline of it. The smoke was going even when we got in there. Could just see the outline of the ship.